So it seems that throughout 10th edition the core Codex Space Marines have started out kind of weakish for the average player, and then throughout the edition have fallen even further behind. Let's talk about the Space Marine balance problem, and a few ideas for how Games Workshop might be able to fix it. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this one I thought we'd do an overview of the issues that face the Space Marine army, how they're looking after another 6 months or so of balance updates, and just a few ideas of the levers that Games Workshop could pull if they wanted to try and make the problem a bit better. For this one I thought we'd revisit one of the talking points of Space Marine balance in 40k 10th edition, which amongst a few other issues is the difference between the core Codex Space Marines with things like Ultramarines, Salamanders, White Scars and Imperial Fists, versus the more divergent chapters such as Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Black Templars and Dark Angels. Sadly Deathwatch kind of being removed from that list now, given that they're part of Codex Imperial Agents. In the last video I did on the channel, I took a look through the tournament statistics for a bunch of armies, and it currently seems that core Codex Space Marines are further behind than ever. A 41% win rate overall, they were around about 44% pre-Pariah Nexus and around 45% in January. Despite clearly not being in a particularly good position, it seems like the problem and the disparity between them and the divergent chapters is getting bigger, not smaller. There's just been repeated balance passes where the more standout things for Codex Space Marines got reined in, and while there have been a few meaningful buffs, a lot of them have fallen on things that were just kind of outright bad before and merely bringing them up to usable rather than actually adding much strength to the army. In particular, there were some notable nerfs in the last one. Big nerfs to the Ironstorm Spearhead, which was one of the stronger detachments, and also Gladiator tanks and the Land Raider Redeemer, and without really meaningful buffs to core Codex Space Marines to balance it out. It's certainly affecting play rate in tournaments. Codex Space Marines are around the 10th most played faction out of the 26 armies in tournament games, and they usually tend to be pretty solidly in the top 5. They are the most collected army in Warhammer 40k by quite some margin. In 10th edition so far, Games Workshop generally haven't been publishing their win rate tables in their MetaWatch articles as they have been previously. Obviously we're not really too sure why they've been doing that, but I feel like there's at least some chance that slight embarrassment over the state of Codex Space Marines might be a motivating factor for that. If they highlight how weak the Codex chapters are, it's going to beg questions when they do balance updates and successfully seem to make them worse or further behind, as opposed to give them help. The biggest issue from a balance point of view, I think, is the divergent chapters being able to use basically everything that the core codex can, besides a couple of really specific things that don't matter that much. And then they get massive amounts of more options on top of that, unique detachments that are often equal or stronger than the ones in the core codex, and far more datasheets, at least some of which tend to be stronger than the average Codex Space Marine datasheets. With balance updates, it's clear that Games Workshop do want divergent chapters to make use of their unique things. It'd be kind of sad if we had Dark Angels fielding no Deathwing, or Space Wolves not having any Thunderwolves and Wolfram because they were too weak versus core codex choices, and that's generally meant that when they're weak they've got buffed. So say for example, when Dark Angels were just running Ironstorm Spearhead really quite a lot, they nerfed that a bit and improved things like Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions to give their unique units a bit more of a standout feel. And that has genuinely helped things out for them, making Dark Angels lists have a lot more Dark Angels flavour than they used to in the competitive games at least. The problem is that if they do that, it means that basically these divergent chapters are just going to be outright superior to core Codex Space Marines. The strongest options go to them so they get to use them. And then when you look at Marine balance options, Games Workshop can't really afford to buff the core Codex Space Marine units too much, otherwise they risk adding power to divergent chapters that are really quite strong already, say for example the Blood Angels being the best in the game near enough, and if they gave loads of core Space Marine datasheets big boost, it could reflect in their strength a little bit, potentially making them overpowered, so they can't really fix the core Codex as well as they might like. On top of that, Space Marines do have the issue of having a really quite a large model range to keep up with as well. It's been cut down a massive amount since a whole load of Firstborn datasheets were rotated out, but they still have 80 plus datasheets in the core codex, and each of those datasheets have got lots of options for how to field them, with all the choices of choosing your chapter and detachment for all sorts of combos. It means that balancing all those Space Marine datasheets can be a headache. It means that a datasheet might just have a super strong combo where it might be so powerful it's problematic in one combination of a chapter and detachment, and therefore it gets nerfed for that, and that just means that it's underpowered for all the other options where it wasn't really a problem. I feel like the Stormraven gunship might be a particularly good example of this. That was genuinely quite strong in Dark Angel's Ironstorm, where it both got big damage boosts from the Ironstorm detachment and could also be pretty tough with a Landspeeder Darkshroud. And Games Workshop wound up upping its cost in quite a big way, despite it very much not being overpowered anywhere else besides that specific example. On top of this, the system of balancing and the huge model range doesn't really help the average player. Space Marines have got so many units that your average player is hardly going to be owning every single datasheet in their collection, so they're rarely going to be playing with an optimized Space Marine list. So maybe compared with a lot of factions, they're unlikely to be achieving the potential of the army to a greater or lesser extent. Since the last Pariah Nexus update, it seems to be about as bad as it's ever been. Core Codex Space Marines on win rates around about 41%, Blood Angels being the top Divergent chapter at 54%, Space Wolves at 53%, Black Templars and Dark Angels in the middle somewhere around about 50-ish, and overall Space Marines have won about 20 tournaments with Pariah Nexus, though it looks like only 2 of those were with the Core Codex, the rest were all with Divergent chapters of one stripe or another. The main issue for the disparity is kind of obvious. There's only really 2 actual advantages of playing Core Codex Space Marines as opposed to playing a Divergent chapter, and that's access to their epic heroes, so say like Marnius Calgar for the Ultramarines or Adrax Agaton for the Salamanders, and the Divergent chapters occasionally have a few units being locked out and lore banned, such as the Black Templars not being able to get Librarians as they don't use them, and the same for Space Wolves for Apothecaries. These might lock out a few units, but rarely enough to be meaningful, so it's only really the epic heroes that actually matter from a balance point of view. Out of the roster of Core Codex Space Marine epic heroes, I feel like plenty of them are usable, some of them are kind of mid to bad, but the issue with the epic heroes is they have to be massively standout good if they're the only advantage that you have for playing a Core Codex army and passing up things like really powerful detachments and loads of other datasheets and characters. Even if, say, Kavan Shrike was very good for the points cost, just hypothetically, if he was better than High Marshal Helbrecht, it still might mean that the overall choice to go Raven Guard versus Black Templars still isn't worth it, given that Kavan Shrike would have to be not only better than Helbrecht, but the difference would have to be big enough to make up for not having the options of taking, say, all their other special characters like the Emperor's Champion and Grimaldus, or of their book datasheets like Sword Brethren and Crusader squads, which if they're better than some of the Codex Marine datasheets, then it could add up to a whole lot of strength across an army, plus also the access to their unique detachment. It does seem that Black Templars, like their Righteous Crusaders, won better than anything from the Core Codex. It does tend to get played far more than Gladius, for example. It just means that when this is the only major lever and the only incentive to play a Core Codex chapter, unless the epic heroes are absolutely broken levels of good, then it's going to be hard to justify picking up other benefits, at least when you're looking for pure strength, which is a shame really. I thought it could be interesting to talk through at least a few credible options that Games Workshop might choose to fix it with, or at least make the gap between the Core Codex and the Divergent chapters less big. Starting with those epic heroes, making all of them just stand out amazing would be one balance lever that they could pull. As mentioned, needing to be so good to outweigh all the benefits that you get across the rest of the army for going for a Divergent chapter. You could either do that by having points cuts to make them just very, very cheap for what they do, or make their rules just stronger and more impactful. Either could work. I guess that would make them pretty much auto-include for their respective chapters though. I feel like while that's one good solution, it might not be enough to outweigh all the stuff you get from other chapters and detachments. It'd be a fair bit more impactful on small games versus big games where any one character just isn't going to do quite as much. And it's also not very helpful if you say wanted to field an Iron Hands army without using Iron Father Phyros in literally every game, so it would only help the armies actually using their epic heroes. One recent idea that Games Workshop showed that they were capable of with Codex Imperial Agents would be to perhaps have different points costs for the Core Codex Space Marines versus Divergent Chapter 1s, much in the same way that the Imperial Agents have 1 points cost if you run Imperial Agents as the core army, and then a different points cost if you're running them as allied units. Seems like the same sort of system could be helpful for the Space Marines. That means that you could afford to buff the Core Codex points cost without worrying if that unit's going to be problematic when applied to, say, Black Templars or Blood Angels at the new points cost. I guess you could do that on 2 different ways depending on the level of admin you wanted. You could literally have a full point section for every single chapter, so the Space Wolves one could be kind of enormous with all the Space Wolf units and all generic picks, or maybe do like they did with the Imperial Agents and have 2 sections for Core Codex Space Marines, one of which applies to only the Core Codex and one of which would apply to Divergent chapters, picking up some generic options. Either way, the downside is, I guess, it would add a bit more bloat and hollow more numbers in the Munitorum field manual. Space Marines have a lot of units, and having to think about balance changes to them both for divergent chapters and for the core codex will be a lot more admin. Plus you could have the complexity of, say, having something like an intercessor having 5 different points costs, or at least say maybe a different points cost with 2 different chapters but not with all of them, so that could be a bit annoying as well. Another option could be to give some sort of specific rules boosts to Space Marines from the core codex using core codex detachments that the divergent chapters don't get. That could maybe be a little bit more fun and positive as opposed to negative. It often feels nicer to buff rather than nerf. There's plenty of ways that you could do this, and Space Marines have had all sorts of bolt-on special rules in the past. Perhaps one very basic idea could be something like tacking on reroll 1s to wound to Oath of Moment, if that's the case. Kind of similar to what the Stern Guard have now as a way to enhance that very slightly. This is very much different from the 4 rerolls to wound that Space Marines had for Oath of Moment at the edition launch. It's actually kind of a minor buff really, as it's only a plus 16% damage increase, only applies to a single unit per turn, and only if you didn't already have Twin Linked or something. Oath of Moment itself is just far more relevant in some games than others as well, so it might not even be the best buffing rule sometimes. I feel like even if it was a minor advantage, just could be nice to have something for the core codex chapters to point at and say that's an objective strength of not going for a divergent chapter. Though I guess you might have to rethink some other special rules. Stern Guard, for example, would need something else if that were the case, but there's plenty of other minor buffs that you could bolt onto the same rule if you really wanted to. I guess perhaps for all the downsides there just might not be enough to help them out, but I feel like there's probably a balance where the rules get strong enough where it would be enough, it's just about striking it. Otherwise, perhaps for a bit more of a fun and chapter-specific sort of option, you could deliver a rules buff to those core codex detachments if they're taking their own themed detachment. So say for example you could have a balanced data slate upgrade that gave each one of the core detachments like Gladius, Stormlance and Anvil and Friends or one extra rule if it's their own themed chapter running it. So say for the Anvil Siege Force you could say if you don't use any chapter models besides Imperial Fist chapter models in your army, you get some sort of boosted detachment rule to represent that they're the masters of the siege warfare. That way you could unlock the better version of the detachment if you took absolutely 0 special characters, or if you only took, say, Lysander and Tor Garadon along. I feel like that could be kind of interesting, as you wouldn't lock any one Space Marine chapter out of any one detachment. You just use the rules that they have now, and you'd be unlikely to make any one chapter drastically overpowered, given that basically all the Codex ones don't seem to be particularly strong currently. Maybe you could have something like, if you play Imperial Fist Anvil Siege Force, then one unit on the board can be selected to move and fire as if stationary, to perhaps better access their detachment rule and give them just that little bit more positioning. Just a complete idea there though. I feel like there's plenty of ways that you could just make the detachment rule fractionally stronger, or just for one unit on the board. It'd likely need a bit of support and a custom solution for each one. Finally, and perhaps one of the less creative ones, is that you could just try and diminish the gap between the core codex and the divergent chapters, even if you know that you wouldn't eliminate it completely. And basically whenever the divergent chapters get overly good, nerf their unique units, and maybe give slight buffs to the core codex ones, perhaps centre most around ones that you think aren't going to add extra strength to their divergent chapters. Say for now, if Blood Angels are really strong, you might slap a few of their special characters with points increases, and then give the core codex buff to units that aren't being used by the divergent chapters that much, perhaps things like standard Terminators or Space Marine armor or aggressors or something, and just gradually move towards a place where the core codex units are just as strong as the divergent chapters, and everyone's sort of in the middle of the field power-wise. I feel like in reality this one would turn into a bit of a depressing solution for the divergent chapters themselves though. It'd mean that there'd just not really be any major incentive to run them with all their unique units, and a lot of the time, if balance wasn't done absolutely perfectly, they'd just be better off running a bunch of generic Primaris under their chapter's flag, more so than using their core unique units that are the ones they really want to put on the table and have making up the vast majority of their army. For that reason I'm a bit unconvinced that this one's a good idea, though I certainly feel like you could do a bit of an element of this for some of the chapters out there and some of the core codex units. You could probably do a fair bit along this sort of lines without it causing problems, even if you don't want to go so far that literally every divergent chapter is just as good playing Ultramarines of different colours as opposed to their unique units, which doesn't really feel like an awesome endpoint either. I feel like some combination of the above 5 could all be things that Games Workshop could do if they wanted to try and even the score a bit on a balanced data slate, Whenever these topics come up though, I see all sorts of solutions being proposed that just realistically don't seem very likely to happen in 10th edition with the way that the rules and codexes have been written. One common talking point is to ban divergent chapters from using the core codex detachments outright, so say no more Gladius for Dark Angels and no more Stormlance for Space Wolves. I guess that might separate them out a little bit for a balanced kind of perspective, but in reality I'm not sure how much it would really help. It'd certainly be a big nerf to Dark Angels, whose codex detachments are pretty bad, but with current tournament results and things it doesn't really feel like it would hurt any of the others that much. Space Wolves would just switch to Champions of Rust, which seems to be equally strong as the Stormlance these days. Black Templars are fine with their Righteous Crusaders, and the Blood Angels, Sons of Sanguinius and Liberator Assault Group are both great. I guess if you did that though, you could buff the core codex detachments and say maybe make the Stormlands a bit more powerful if it's only limited to the Biker datasheets. So I guess in theory a bit of separation could be helpful for balance purposes in the long run. I feel like it could be a little bit sad to do this though. I think I'm not really against the idea that divergent chapters should be able to run some of the more standard Codex Space Marine formations. Most of them are pretty flexible and have lots of different ways of making war. It just feels like there should probably be options that they could potentially use and occasionally might be sort of strong, but probably not the default strongest way to play them. Otherwise, one that's clearly not going to happen is to ditch the supplement system and have divergent chapters just be their entirely separate codexes, like say Death Guardians versus Codex Chaos Space Marines. That one's definitely not going to happen in 10th edition, given that we've already got supplement books for Dark Angels and Blood Angels out. And I feel like it often can create issues if you say wanted to update any one unit. Say if you wanted to do a patch for Land Raiders, you'd have to do so both in the core Codex Space Marine book and also for others. And sometimes in the past that sort of system has meant that you have weird different versions of units depending on how recently the books have been updated. I remember in editions long past when say the Dark Angels Tactical Squad had really quite different rules to the ones in the core Space Marine Codex. Other options could be to release more stuff to sell the Codex chapters, to expand them with more character options and some unique units of their own, maybe something flame related for the Salamanders, some Honor Guard for the Ultramarines, or some breaching riot shields for the Imperial Fists. I don't know if they'll wind up doing something like that at some stage, but I feel like that's unlikely to ever happen from a balance point of view. They generally do that if they had the models and thought they'd sell well. It's likely to take a very long time for them to make those kind of releases, as they'd be basically doing it for 6 different armies at once. And I'm sure that plenty of people out there would say that 40k has got too much for a Space Marine focus rather than too little, and trying to develop another 6 mini armies worth of Space Marines might not be the way that actually helps the problem that much. We've already got the core codex and 4 major divergent options. Finally, again, people like to often talk about reducing the size of the Space Marine model range, which I guess will almost certainly happen with more Firstborn being phased out in 11th edition. As mentioned, I feel like it could be something that is a bit of an exacerbating factor to Space Marine balance problems. I don't really feel like an army having lots of options is generally a bad thing. It does perhaps mean it's a bit more work, and Games Workshop needs to be more intelligent with how they're realised, particularly with having lots of options for different chapters to run them in. But I feel like there'd be pretty major outcry and loss of trust if they started deleting new Primaris units left, right and centre. In general, I'm not against an army having more options and different units. It feels like they should be able to have those units balanced in their own right, as they do have quite a lot of different ways with which they can pull levers, different points costs in different armies maybe being one of the most obvious ones. In any case, it'll certainly be interesting to see what Games Workshop do about this, if anything. I feel like out of these options, probably my favourite might be to have some sort of rules boost for either Codex chapters playing Codex attachments, or the individual chapters playing their themed attachments. Both of those feel like they could be a nice way to add a positive rule to a struggling army, as opposed to locking out options or adding loads of complexity with more point sections, even if that might be a bit more of a controlled way to do it. I feel like this one will be a really nice one to see turn up in a balanced data slate, along with a bunch of other changes at some point. Hopefully they care enough to do so. It'd just be good to have Space Marine chapters like Raven Guard, Imperial Fists and White Scars who just have one character, still have some sort of interesting and important way to play them, and actually have some sort of advantages on paper versus all the other options out there, as opposed to basically being directly inferior in a way that you can obviously tell from theory crafting and you're not even really weighing up that much. In any case, let me know your thoughts as to the entire balance situation. Look forward to your ideas down in the comments below, and how would you try and fix this if you were Games Workshop yourself? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.